bank of the Dnieper River in the face of Ukrainian tanks. Kherson City was the only regional capital captured by Russia since the invasion. It is now back in Ukrainian hands. And no matter what we may rightly say, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the military sense in such a withdrawal, one should not underestimate nor diminish the incredible success for the Ukrainian armed forces in pushing the Russians to need to withdraw in the first place. But that success in Kherson, Madam Deputy Speaker, is only the start of a really long, hot and hard winter. Cold and wet weather will make fighting harder, but as the going gets tough, the UK will continue doing all we can to give the Ukrainians what they need. With temperatures likely to sink to as low as -20 degrees, we have responded to Ukrainian requests for more cold weather equipment. Last week, the Prime Minister announced that Ukrainian recruits leaving the UK will be kitted out for the extreme cold. We are also providing 25,000 sets of extreme cold weather clothing, 20,000 heavy-duty sleeping bags, and 150 insulated tents to prevent cold-related injuries and ensure troops can operate effectively and efficiently. Just 2 seconds. Other European allies are doing likewise, and all of that care for the Ukrainian armed forces as they face the bleak midwinter, is in stark contrast with what the Russians are providing their troops with. And I dread to think what Russian families would think if they were to see inside their sons, husbands, boyfriends, fathers' rucksacks.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. He's right to say that for the Ukrainian forces, the capture of Kherson is potentially a turning point, not least because with longer-range missiles supplied to them, it may be possible to hit Russian Navy targets in the Black Sea and therefore begin to eliminate the possibility of Russia using its Navy to fire caliber cruise missiles into Ukraine against the infrastructure that he talked about at the beginning of his speech. Is it now time for us to revisit the supply of longer range missiles that at the beginning of the conflict we ruled out?
Well, Madam Deputy, we keep all of these things under review, and each time President Putin has ordered an escalation within Ukraine, we have looked at what we can do to strengthen Ukrainian capabilities. The reality is that the gains that Ukraine has made down towards Kherson has brought the ground lines of communication into Crimea into range of GMRS and HIMARS systems. And arguably, it is a militarily equally valuable target set, but perhaps not quite as provocative to be targeting those ground lines of communication rather than necessarily into Crimea itself, although of course the Ukrainians reserve the right to set whatever targets they do, and as we've seen in recent months, they have done as they need on occasion and very successfully too. Madam Speaker, we are the largest European provider of military material in Ukraine and have to date provided equipment to allow Ukraine to fight back against attacks on sea, land and air. The UK has provided a variety of air defence systems, including Stormer vehicles fitted with Starstreak launchers and hundreds of missiles. These are helping to protect Ukraine's critical national infrastructure, including its power plants. Last week, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, announced the provision of almost 1,000 surface-to-air missiles to help counter the Russian threat to Ukrainian infrastructure. We continue to engage with partners all over the world, looking to buy up whatever supplies we can find of the weapon systems that the Ukrainians need most, air defence principally amongst them. Madam Deputy Speaker, we must think of more than just the here and now, however. One day this war will end and Ukraine will need to be rebuilt. Its power restored, roads restored, bridges re-established, and schools, houses and hospitals repaired. The Kyiv School of Economics puts the cost of direct damage to buildings and infrastructure at some $127 billion already. So here too the UK is providing support for Ukraine's early recovery through the Partnership Fund for a Resilient Ukraine, a £37 million multi-donor fund that the UK belongs to. Through this fund, the UK, alongside other countries, has already provided extensive support for the repair of buildings, as well as other activities in the Kyiv Oblast and other parts of Ukraine. UK Export Finance has committed £3.5 billion of cover to Ukraine for priority projects across the infrastructure, healthcare, clean energy and security sectors. And the UK is supporting the Halo Trust, which so far has demined over 16,000 square miles of land in Kyiv Oblast so that people once more will be able to return to the safety of their homes. agricultural land and businesses. Next year, the UK will host a 2023 reconstruction conference to accelerate Ukraine's recovery from the damage caused by Russia's invasion. Madam Deputy Speaker, the war that Russia began has now lasted the best part of a year. Despite overwhelming odds, Ukraine has shown remarkable resilience, and I am proud that the UK has played a major role in helping Ukrainians push back the invaders. As we prepare for the difficult months to come, our resolve will remain unwavering. President Putin has exacted a terrible toll on Ukraine, but he continues to make the wrong calls. Far from being ground down, today Ukrainian forces are better equipped, better trained, and have better morale. They will win, and Putin will lose. And when he does, the UK will be there, as we have been there throughout this conflict, to help Ukraine repair, rebuild, and renew. And, Speaker, I just conclude by reflecting that thousands of men and women from the British Armed Forces have been involved in the support of Ukraine over the course of last year. They've been working phenomenally hard, often in roles that don't catch the public eye. We're very grateful to everything that they've done and the sacrifices that their families have made in supporting them. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in Ukraine. Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I make my remarks, I'd like to pay tribute to our armed forces and veterans who came together on Remembrance Sunday yesterday. I was on Plymouth Hoe yesterday morning, but wherever we were, we saw a nation pause, thank those who had served, and remember those who did not come back and those who were ever changed by war and conflict. We are now on day 264 into Vladimir Putin's criminal invasion of Ukraine, and with each day it becomes clearer and clearer that this misguided war is failing. Putin has not achieved his objectives. Indeed, he has actually strengthened the Western alliance, and with each of his decisions, he further strengthens our resolve. The Ukrainian liberation of Kherson, a region Russia had illegally occupied for more than 8 months, is a testament to the skill, bravery and fortitude of the Ukrainian military and is a significant blow to the Kremlin. The Ukrainian advance comes only weeks after a ceremony in Moscow where Putin announced the forever annexation of Kherson along with Russian-occupied areas of Donetsk, Luhansk and Zaporizhia. Russia's retreat from Kherson is a significant moment in the war, and the withdrawal shines a light on how badly the invasion is going for Putin. He's already forcibly enlisted more than 200,000 new recruits into the Russian army, and with around 100,000 Russian soldiers having been killed or wounded since the war began in February, the casualty rate of poorly trained, poorly equipped troops with low morale remains catastrophic. Body bags and burnt-out tanks is all that Putin can offer his people. As the Ukrainians continue to show incredible resilience in defending their homeland, we must continue to do all we can to support Ukraine both now and in the months ahead. The Minister will know that on this side of the House he has our full support for the support that the government is providing to our friends in Ukraine, and I want to put on record our thanks to the United Kingdom's armed forces, not only in their work supporting Ukraine, coordinating the supplies of military aid and humanitarian support, but also reinforcing our allies on NATO's eastern flank and training Ukrainian troops here through Operation Interflex. On Britain's military help to Ukraine, the government has had and will continue to have our fullest support. We welcome the announcement made last week on the provision of further surface-to-air missiles to Ukrainian forces, and we welcome the announcement of support to protect and upgrade Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. But given the parameters of that support, I wish to press the Minister ever so gently but seriously on some of the uncertainties that are still unclear about our support that we are wanting to provide. The UK must support Ukraine for the long term, something I believe there's cross-party support on. But that means we must move beyond the ad hoc announcements that have been made by ministers about donating weapons to be clear about a long-term strategy for military, economic and diplomatic assistance through 2023 and beyond. And humanitarian support. In August, the government announced that the UK and its allies will begin to establish a plan of action to support Ukraine into 2023, but we still haven't seen one. Can the Minister say where it is and what is the delay in producing this plan? We're running out of 2022. So will the report and the strategy be ready by the end of this year? What state is it in now? And is it a costed plan or just a set of ambitions? The reason we ask those questions is not to put the minister on a hook or put him in a bad place, but to press him because we want to see the support gotten right. And scrutiny and clarity for the United Kingdom will help our allies to make sure they are equally as robust in supporting Ukraine. Even before the Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, Labour's been making the case for an updated integrated review. The Defence Secretary previously argued against it, but now it argues for it, which is a welcome U-turn from the government. I know the Minister has had a similar change of heart on this one here, and that is a welcome position as well. But the government's given little signal as to what will be in the integrated review refresh and how it will be updated. So I'd be grateful if the Minister could also set out what he believes in the integrated review needs to be updated. Does the review have a clear terms of reference that can be scrutinised? Can the Minister tell us which cuts to the armed forces he now wants to reverse? And can he tell us whether further army cuts will be halted? It was a fair question by the member for Barnsley Central at last Defence Questions when he asked, why is the government pressing ahead with cuts to our armed forces before the integrated review reports? Yeah. What happens if the integrated review says we should have kept the capabilities and equipment the MOD is scrambling to scrap now? What happens then? Madam Deputy Speaker, it's no secret that NLAWs have been vital to the defence of Ukraine, but the Secretary of State is yet to adequately explain whether a new contract to replenish UK stockpiles for NLAWs has been signed and who with. NLAW production will require old production lines to be rebuilt and restarted. So if an order was placed today, can the Minister tell us how long it would be until a new NLAW rolled off the production line? Is it really 2 years away? If that is true, the delay is dangerous and one that I think the UK can ill afford. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to turn to an area that is a little bit technical, but I think is a serious one that I don't think has been addressed, and that is the use of dual use of technology, that civilian technology that can have a military application. Last month, the United States imposed a set of new sanctions on Russia, targeting a network accused of procuring military and dual-use technologies from US manufacturers and illegally supplying them to the Russian war machine. RUSI, the UK defence think tank, confirmed in August of this year that UK components are appearing in Russian weaponry. That can include oscillators and standard crystals. Now, no UK-produced equipment should end up in the hands of Putin and his generals. And this is especially difficult, though, to be sure of when it comes to dual-use equipment. This House has already passed sanctions on dual-use equipment, but the concern is that Western electronics and technologies are still reaching Russian weapon manufacturers. This will be concerning to colleagues, so we need clarity that British firms are not, in good faith, making materials or contributing to the supply chain of Western manufacturers whose end product could end up killing Ukrainian civilians. So can I ask the Minister what steps the government is taking to identify dual-use technologies that could be used by Putin, and what steps is he taking to stop those technologies getting into the hands of Russia or their agents? Does he feel that the current dual-use sanctions are sufficient? And what steps can he take, working with our allies, to monitor and shut off possible purchasing routes for Russia of Western dual-use equipment like gyroscopes, Wi-Fi technology, ceramic chips, resistors and semiconductors? I realise this is a complex area, and I realise I put the Minister on the spot here for his colleague from the Foreign Office to reply to, and so I'd be grateful if the Minister can't set out this now, whether he could put a letter in the House of Commons library. This is a difficult area, but one that we must make sure that we're getting right. Madam Deputy Speaker, we know that since the war began, Russian troops have been committing atrocities against Ukrainian civilians. Just as in Bucha, Izium and Mariupol, there is now evidence of Russian war crimes in the Kherson region. We will not know for some time how many civilians the Russians have butchered, but we must be unrelenting in our pursuit of these war criminals until each and every one of them has stood trial for their crimes. As Ukrainians face the arrival of winter, it's becoming increasingly clear that Putin's strategy is to target civilian infrastructure, including energy and water plants. The Minister has set out some support that the UK government is providing, but can he also set out what additional missile defence the UK is providing to our allies to protect Ukrainian infrastructure from missile attacks by Russia, and what plans he has to deal with the potential for additional flow of cold and hungry refugees this winter, because the effect of Russian bombardment of civilian infrastructure is already degrading the ability of Ukraine to provide clean water and power to all its population, and that will drive a further humanitarian crisis. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to briefly now turn to how we can afford the defence of the UK and our allies in Ukraine. We know the government's disastrous mini-budget has cost 30 billion, which is the equivalent of 60% of the UK's current defence budget. And that sheer amount of money could have been better spent on hospitals, teachers, and the cost of living crisis. But in defence terms, that's the cost of 23 brand new Type 26 frigates. It's a huge amount of money that has been abused by the government. The MOD is the only government department in the current spending round with a real terms revenue cut each year. New IFS figures show that, adjusted for inflation, that's a 2.7 billion real terms cut to defence spending. At the Defence Select Committee last week, the Secretary of State for Defence has said with the additional defence inflation, that's 8 billion additional costs he has to his budget. If we are to continue to provide the support to Ukraine and continue to make sure that we can afford an enhanced forward presence for our NATO allies and our other NATO commitments, we need to have certainty that the funding will be available as required for our armed forces. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been rereading the rather good Defence Select Committee report called Shifting the Goalposts, which shows that Labour governments have always spent more on our nation's defence than Conservative governments. Does the commitment to raise defence spending to 3% of GDP by 2030 still exist? Can the Minister see a point where defence spending for this government falls below the 2% GDP NATO target? And given the previous comments on defence spending, can the Minister say whether he and the Secretary of State will still be in their places if defence spending is cut in the Chancellor's autumn statement on Thursday? Happy to.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And on the subject of defence spending, I don't believe this has come up yet in this debate, but clearly Putin is using propaganda as a serious weapon in this battle, and one that I think we all have an interest in countering. And so it would be helpful if the Minister and the government in their summing up comments could give some reassurance that UK is committed to the counter-disinformation unit and are working in collaboration with the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office to ensure that we play our part in ensuring this propaganda does not win in Ukraine and does not win elsewhere either.
Here. I thank my honourable friend from Newcastle for her intervention. I think she is right. Putin has invested heavily in disinformation technologies and in resources to spread misinformation and disinformation in the news feeds of social media right across the world, including here in the United Kingdom. That investment was not made on a whim. It was made against a clear strategy that says they wish to divide, split, and misinform Western populations to use our democracy against us. And we must be absolutely determined to protect our democracy and to protect our allies, that we tackle disinformation, misinformation, and those dark cyber activities online. We're not just talking about state-sponsored hacking and cyber attacks, although that is one end of the spectrum. We're talking about all our constituents seeing things on their Facebook news feeds which are deliberately deployed and shared to try and split and degrade public opinion, to create the impression that the United Kingdom's support for our friends in Ukraine is somehow coming from a dark place, when it is not. And that means further action to strengthen our work on social media. It means looking at where Russia's investing in disinformation, and it means looking at how we can strengthen our civil society against that in the future. And I hope that the Minister and his colleagues that are looking after the online safety bill, for instance, will take that seriously as well, because this is not just military-grade activity we need to look at. This is everything through to how each of us uses our social media. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I want there to be no doubt that on this side of the House, we share the resolve of the government in supporting Ukraine for as long as is necessary to defeat Putin. But as the Ukrainian countryside turns to mud and then freezes over, we're about to enter an incredibly difficult winter, where military doctrine normally suggests that front lines are frozen and civilian populations suffer further. The Ukrainians are showing incredible resolve in standing up to Russia, but they can't do that without continued Western support. So how we use the winter months to ensure that our supply lines, our commitment, our resolve and our technologies are available to our friends in Ukraine will be as important as it will be for the Ukrainians. Because how we use the winter months to prepare for the expected spring offensives will be crucial in keeping the pressure firmly on the Kremlin and ensuring Ukraine wins. Thank you.
Jonathan Janoglu.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As we rejoice at the liberation of Kherson, we need to be mindful that Ukraine is still very much a country at war. As Russian Federation tanks rolled across the border onto sovereign Ukraine territory on the 24th of February, the world bore witness to an attack against the post-Second World War settlement of a magnitude and a kind without precedent. And I congratulate the government on the superb and consistent support that the UK has provided to Ukraine. But the situation constantly changes, and I believe that we now need a rethink on sanctions. I frequently hear people, including UK ministers, saying that this is Putin's war, not that of the Russian people, thereby laying the blame of an entire nation's aggression at the feet of one man. This is an aggression, we must not forget, that seeks to erase Ukraine from the map, destroy its culture, turn back the clock to a period when the Russia-centric Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe and its peoples. Having had the opportunity to visit Ukraine most recently in September and speak with some of the brave men and women valiantly defending their homeland, the notion that this is solely Putin's war is one that I would now reject. Of course, Western-induced regime change within the Russian Federation is not a sound basis for the United Kingdom's foreign policy. But even if it were, I do not believe that the idea mooted by some that new leadership in Moscow would necessarily bring the war to an end. In fact, I believe the opposite to be possible, with a new leader trying to burnish their nationalistic credentials by taking even greater destructive and indiscriminate military action. In effect, no Putin does not necessarily equate to no war. I give way.
Grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. It was a pleasure to be with him in Kyiv earlier this year. He's making an incredibly important point, because sometimes we hear our allies say we have to make sure that Putin can't do this again. Actually, that is the wrong analysis. We have to make sure that Russia cannot do this again.
The Honourable Gentleman's absolutely right. Right Honourable Gentleman's absolutely right, and I'm going to try and prove that point somewhat further, because many of those in leadership roles that surround the current Russian president, such as the Chechen leader Kadyrov, who has suggested, of course, using a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine, they espouse rigid nationalist views, and they should not and cannot be absolved from blame for the invasion, as the term Putin's war may allow. It is also important to highlight that many towns in reoccupied Ukraine now have unmarked graves resulting from murders perpetrated by members of the Russian armed forces, with the Bucha massacre a poignant example that we all have a duty to remember and reflect upon. Reports are also rife of mass rapes, looting, torture, removal of children, and confiscation of vital foodstuffs. Again, all deeds done by soldiers and administrators of the occupying power. And it's clear to me that many people of the Russian Federation are up to their necks in heinous crimes committed during the ongoing war against the Ukrainian people. And the individual perpetrators must bear full responsibility for this and, of course, be prosecuted. So a case against those actively engaged in the invasion is clear. But what about the wider Russian people themselves? The problem is that by using the term Putin's war, it's possible to excuse, overlook, or ignore that the war in all its gore and injustice remains very popular amongst most of the Russian population. And it's not just Putin and his cronies and his oligarchs. Some Russians, a small minority, have laudably taken a stand. Memorably and notably, Marina Ovsyannikova, who staged an on-air protest in March announcing the war. Such defiance has, however, been more of an exception than the rule. Indeed, polling from within the Russian Federation continues to indicate strong support of over 70% for both the war and Putin amongst its populace.
I thank the honourable member for giving way to making an excellent speech, as ever. I mean, it is a complex issue, the extent to which the Russians support this war. And he's not wrong to say what he said, that it is still very popular. I just wonder if a slightly more generous way of putting it is that there is a hardcore against, very brave people as he's outlined, there is a hardcore for the military bloggers, the nationalist community who are becoming increasingly concerned. But in the last 20 years, because of the amount of propaganda in the Russian society, most Russians know to avoid politics as an issue because you let the people in power get on with things. And so I don't think it's not so much popularity of the war as a sense of agnosticism towards politics and a sense of keeping away from it as a subject. Would you accept that point?
Well, I accept that it's a subject that we could go into in some degree, but I would make the point that of those Russians that have been leaving Russia and going to places like Armenia or Georgia or over 250,000 to Turkey, it is by no means proven that they are anti-Putin. In fact, a lot of research says that they're going to these countries because they either want to pursue their business activities and can't because of sanctions, or because they don't want to be called up on the reserve list. And so they leave, not because they don't like President Putin. So what I'm suggesting here is that at some point, systems and leaders need to take collective responsibility for the actions of the state and armed forces that operate in their name. For Russians, I would argue that that time has long passed. And if we agree that there should be collective responsibility, then we can make the moral case for collective sanctions, economic and travel. Travel restrictions, like those implemented by 6 EU states, are important as they practically reinforce the message of collective responsibility compared to economic sanctions, which will mainly apply only to wealthier people. As the situation currently stands, at the end of the war, whenever that may be, or indeed before, frozen assets across the West and other areas of the globe that have been sanctioned, including here in the United Kingdom, will be reclaimed by their owners. The public, including many constituents in Huntingdon that I have corresponded with about the situation in Ukraine, naturally assume that a frozen super yacht owned by a sanctioned individual will be sold with the proceeds used for reconstruction. We're talking here of some £18 billion of frozen assets, not including real estate, in the UK alone. This is not, alas, currently the case. And if the situation is not remedied, I believe an embarrassing political situation, not to mention a morally dubious one, beckons. So I think ministers should be prepared to consider, working with our allies, how frozen assets can be legally seized, sold, and the revenue put to work for Ukraine's rebuilding. The World Bank's assessment made in September is that Ukraine will need $349 billion for recovery and reconstruction. But I think it's worth saying that it's not just a question of law changes. It's also about adopting a more aggressive attitude within the existing system. For instance, when the FBI boarded the sanctioned Mr. Karamov's yacht Amadea in Fiji, it looks like the United States used the oligarch's maintenance of the yacht as a criminal breach of sanctions, which thereby allowed confiscation of the yacht. We could and should also be more assertive than we are. As for the possible law changes to facilitate the confiscation, the first is a revisiting of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1939. During the Second World War, this act allowed the government of the day to confiscate assets owned by residents of enemy countries and British territories. The Act focuses squarely on the assets of any person or organisation of countries the United Kingdom is at war with. And thankfully, there has not, obviously, been much cause to review it since 1945. However, an amendment to the definition of war could provide a valuable basis for considering how Russian assets could be seized to the benefit of Ukraine and its reconstruction. Secondly, I refer to Canada's Budget Implementation Act, passed in June of this year, which includes amendments that allow for the forfeiture of property that is subject to a seizure or restraint order under the Special Economic Measures Act and their Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, their Sergei Magnitsky legislation. This is done under both regimes using forfeiture orders, allowing the relevant minister of the Canadian government to apply to a court to forfeit assets that have already been seized or frozen. A number of safeguards are rightly built into the legislation. So, for instance, any person who appears to have an interest in the property may be heard by the relevant court. A further possible avenue that I wish to highlight is one proposed by the Washington, D.C.-based New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, who formulated a multilateral action model on reparations. In this model, the Institute draws 13 convincing conclusions which lay the basis for an international, effective, and legal reparations and compensation scheme. The model builds on the relatively recent, and practical example of the Kuwait Compensation Fund, which together with the UN Compensation Commission paid some $52 billion in compensation to 1.5 million claimants over 30 years following the Iraqi invasion in 1990. The establishment of the Fund and Commission was only possible due to agreement of those nations with a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. And of course, as an aggressor in Russia is an aggressor in Ukraine's case, its exact roadmap cannot unfortunately be followed. However, instead, the Institute makes the argument for working through the UN General Assembly instead of the Security Council. Madam Deputy Speaker, these avenues that I've highlighted today are but a number that I think are worthy of wider consideration. There are others. What is crucial, however, is that the conversation surrounding compensation and reparations now begins in earnest. Because just to continue saying that this is only Putin's war is no longer relevant or morally sustainable.
SNP spokesman, Martin Docherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, let me first of all associate myself with the words of the Minister in relation to the armed forces supporting the men and women of the Ukrainian armed forces in terms of training, and also the Shadow Minister in terms of Remembrance Sunday. I'm very mindful of my own brother, who is a veteran from Iraq and Afghanistan. Actually, for the very first time, attended the cenotaph in Whitehall at the weekend with former comrades. I have to say it is indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, welcome to be standing here following the statement about the liberation of Kherson, and like so many people, it's been a joy to watch the videos and accounts over the weekend of the liberation. There is, though, unfortunately, a pattern in this conflict of the elation after these liberations of towns and villages being followed by the revulsion and anger as we discover the litany of crimes committed by Russian armed forces and administrators during their occupation. Now, I have to say, I shudder to think what would happen to those who were brave enough to resist that invasion during the early days of February, so memorably caught on camera for the world to see. Nonetheless, forcing this invading force off the west bank of Dnieper should be celebrated for the triumph that it is, along with the liberation of the last remaining regional capital under renewed occupation. Now, the decision of the retreating forces to blow bridges and mine the lines of the withdrawal demonstrates the direction they believe the conflict to be moving in, though we must hope that it can move as quickly as possible in the direction to avoid Kherson facing the same sort of retribution that Russia has visited on the likes of Kharkiv and Mykolaiv. Such targeting and destroying of civilian infrastructure has become such a feature of Russian military handbook again demonstrates the weakness of their position and their repeated inability to abide by the key tenets, I think the whole House will agree, of the Geneva Convention itself, namely in their failure to avoid unnecessary suffering and the failing to distinguish between civilians, Madam Deputy Speaker, and combatants. It is a damning indictment of their Ruski Mir, which they claim to be defending, as you're ever likely to see. Now, I'm sure the Minister and others across the House will join me in beseeching the Russian Federation to withdraw from the rest of the country, which they have illegally occupied since 2014, to avoid this suffering from continuing. The liberation of such a large port also brings into focus, I think the Minister touched on it when they opened up the debate, about the global consequences of continuing this unnecessary conflict. Not only because Kherson's famous watermelons can now be exported, but as a whole host of other agricultural products of Ukraine's famous black soil too. These grains and vegetable oils have been effectively held hostage by the Kremlin, by Vladimir Putin, as a part of a strategy of resource terrorism. seeking to punish some of the poorest people in the world as a way of putting pressure on those who would support Ukraine. As the G20 summit actually comes to a close, Madam Deputy Speaker, overshadowed by this coercive diplomacy, I'm sure we can all agree that we hope that this is not the same issue, come the next summit. And as we talk about exports, we have to also think about the health of the Ukrainian economy as a whole. And let's not forget the importance of providing, again, as the Minister mentioned, the long-term economic guarantees to Ukraine that can ensure that it's able to rebuild when the end of the conflict comes, as it must. The incredible potential that has hitherto been unable to be fully realised can only be released with a generous range of measures and with a full integration into the Western economic networks, as also Ukraine would wish, including the European Union. However, regardless of the military and economic support we give Ukraine and its people, we cannot forget the human element in all of this. And it's the fact that these are people who are fighting so much more than just for economic growth or European security. They are fighting simply for the right to exist. That is a right to exist, Madam Deputy Speaker, as Ukrainians. But it's also a right to exist as the people who they are. And I have to say I'm glad to be able to get the opportunity to acknowledge the contribution made by the LGBTQ+ Ukrainians in this conflict. Their struggle, I would say, is emblematic of what is at stake here. Not only because Putin and other Kremlin talking heads have specifically made their increasing prominence in that society a major plank of their spurious rationale for invasion. We know very well in this country that the realities of wartime society can bring about large-scale social change, as previously underrepresented represented groups in society come forward to demonstrate the role that they can play in society. So it's through this conflict that we've seen how LGBTQ+ Ukrainians have come forward and served in their droves at every level, commonly known as the Pride Brigade. And I'm very much grateful for the work done by people like Maxim Ersterev, who has documented the contribution these Ukrainians have made to the defence of their common homeland. And there is indeed evidence that it's changing Ukrainian society, I believe, for the better. Thanks to Maxim, I found out this summer that almost 60% of Ukrainians now have a more positive attitude to their LGBTQ+ siblings, a massive increase since 2016, when they were last asked the question. These are people who know what it is that they are fighting for the possibility to live in a country where they are free from the types of dystopian control and coercion that we are now seeing too often in Putin's Russia. So let me bring my remarks to an end, Madam Deputy Speaker, by thanking the ministers and indeed the government for continuing to ensure that Ukraine can continue to push these invaders out of their country. They can be assured of the support from everyone on these benches, and I think essentially everyone across the House, in making sure that it continues to be the case. Here's hoping we'll be marking the liberation of Ukraine sooner rather than later.
Bob Seeley.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I won't try the House's patience for too long. I just want to make some general points. And I think the Minister is completely right when he says that it is a very, very important victory. The Kherson victory was enormously important, regardless of whether it was a significant military or in military terms or significant symbolically. And he obviously makes the point that it's difficult to invade a country if you're going backwards, and we can all agree with that. I would say, although it is symbolically dreadful, it is not yet a military game changer. And I think the Russian strategy, just to build on the question I asked a bit earlier, I think the Russian strategy at the moment seems to be two-pronged. Firstly, Surovikin, who's with his Syrian experience, has said to the Russian Ministry of Defense, give me a line that I can hold. And Kherson, because it was on the western bank of the Dnipro, Kherson was simply not holdable. It was a death trap and it was a disaster waiting for the Russian military. So Surovikin, by pulling out of Kherson city and pulling over to the eastern bank of the Dnipro, has effectively got the Dnipro River between him and the Ukrainians. And for those, I lived in Ukraine from 90 to 95, and for those people who know their geography in Ukraine, the river Dnipro from south of Kherson all the way up to Zaporozhye. At its thinnest, it's half a kilometre. If you add the water banks, if you add the Konka River, the River Konka, if you add the marshland, if you add open grassland, it is a minimum of 3 kilometres wide. If you go up to Zaporozhye, where the nuclear power plant is, it's more of a lake, and it's about 10 to 12 kilometres wide. So Surovikin, by moving his forces to the eastern bank of the Dnipro, has effectively got the Dnipro as a very considerable buffer between him and the Ukrainian forces. And realistically, any Ukrainian advance is not going to happen, is not going to take place south of Zaporozhye, because simply the geography, I mean, you might as well try to, cross the channel. You cannot do it without phenomenal resources, and you're going across significant open territory, and the casualty rate, even against the Russian forces disorganized and demoralized as this, would simply be not acceptable. It would fail and be a significant counter against the Ukrainians. So that's the first. Surovikin has said, firstly, I need a defensible line. And getting the Dnipro the right side of him, he now has a defensible line all the way up to Zaporozhye. The second thing I think Surovikin has done, and again, for those of us who sadly followed him in Syria, this is par for the course. He's prioritized the destruction of civilian morale. Now in Syria, one of the really awful and depressing things was the way that the Syrians and the Russians, who are one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, was the way that the Syrians and the Russians, their Russian backers, prioritized the destruction of civilian targets. And most importantly, and most tragically, and I talked to many Syrian doctors about this, was that the Russians targeted the destruction of hospitals. Because by destroying hospitals first, you destroyed popular morale. The men would fight as long as their women and their families would stay. But for that to happen, you needed some kind of food supply and you needed hospitals. But to destroy the hospitals meant that the women and children fled, and without the women and children, the men effectively were pulled back as well. And so by destroying civilian infrastructure, you destroy morale. The other thing noticeably, and it is important for this debate, that the Russians did, or the Syrians with their Russian backers did, for 4 years Aleppo was bombed. And for 4 years Aleppo survived, and civilian life in bizarre and horrendous circumstances continued. The Syrians and their Russian backers used chemical weapons for 17 days, and they cleared the city. So actually, it wasn't, despite 4 years of bombardment, and despite actually the attacks on the hospitals, which took a few months to clear civilian populations, what cleared it pretty much overnight was the use of chemical weapons. And I say that now because the Russians are still talking about, making accusations about bioterrorism against the Ukrainians and against the Americans. And they're still, as we know, talking about nuclear, and I'll come on to that in a second. So the Russians are still holding out the option of using chemical and nuclear weapons. And one should not simply dismiss this as bluff, because we don't know it's bluff, because we cannot tell. Therefore, it is not just bluff. It may well be, but we do not know. So those are the two-pronged attack, the two prongs of Russian strategy. Get a defensible line, or a line that you think is defensible, and destroy civilian infrastructure. And behind that, I mean, actually, if you go back to it, the current phase of this war started back, I think, in September, when I was in Ukraine, I think with several right honourable members who are here. It's good to see them. And in fact, we saw Zelensky on that Sunday, and they were just overjoyed because you had the collapse of Kharkiv positions, and we were there as it was happening. That was the beginning of the new phase, because it was a phase of the war where the Russians realised, actually, we can't win. And it was that weekend that the Ukrainians thought, actually, we can win this war. And I think that was a very, very important moment. So the Russians now, by having a defensive line and attacking civilian infrastructure, they bought some time. They probably bought themselves a few months. The next phase of the war is going to take place probably in the spring, when the Russian positions come under significant pressure. And they will come under significant pressure, if my understanding of what's happening is correct, in the south, between Zaporozhye and Donetsk, or in the east, between Lugansk, around the Lugansk area. And it may be that the Ukrainians try a feint to the south while attacking Donbass because that's where their best armour is. But either way, the new phase, when it happens with a spring offensive or potentially late winter offensive, that will be what we will witness, if we do witness it, will be the collapse of Russian positions. And the critical point here is not necessarily defeat in Donbass, which will be great for the Ukrainians, but the critical point for the strategy in the war will be the collapse of the land corridor between Crimea and Donetsk. And if that happens, it is then the beginning of the end for the Russians, because they can continue to hold the area of Donbass they seized in 2014. Not going to make much difference. They could potentially still keep hold of Crimea, which I think will be the last to go. But the destruction of the land corridor means the final defeat, and we're entering then the end game. It will be beginning of the end for Russian forces if that land corridor goes. And at that point, Putin has a series of very, very important decision points, to use a military term. Does he go nuclear? Does he not? Does he use chemical? Does he not? Does he blow up the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station? Does he not? These become absolutely critical because the collapse of Russian military defeat in war often signals the collapse of a regime. And for people like the KGB or the FSB, whatever they're calling themselves now, or the FSB, they do not distinguish between the collapse of the state and collapse of the regime. So the collapse of the regime and the collapse of the state, they're not identical, but they're much closer than it would be in our country. So if you go back to, take the last wars of the last 200 years that the Russians have fought, minus the Napoleonic War that they won, and minus World War II that they won, pretty much every other war they've lost, and every other war has then resulted in the collapse or the significant reform of the Russian state. So the Crimean War resulted in the end of serfdom. The Russia-Japanese War resulted in the 1905 revolution. We know that the horrors of World War I resulted in the disasters, the appalling disasters of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Finnish War could have gone very badly wrong in 1940, and the Afghan War heralded the end of the Soviet Union. So when this war is lost by the Russian state, then we have to start asking ourselves, how desperate will Putin be and what will happen internally to Russia? And I've got, for the Russia APPG, for folks who are interested, we have Leonid Volkov coming to talk to us on Wednesday morning, who's Navalny's chief of staff, and he will start talking about what is the potential for the collapse of the Russian state. So there are clearly some very, very significant decisions. Internally, Putin has arrested, murdered, killed off, imprisoned many of his opponents, most noticeably now Navalny, who may or may not be slowly, his health worsening in the penal colony that he's in. I think he's doing 9 years. So he doesn't have pressure from the democratic bloc. What Putin does have pressure from is two groups. And it's worthwhile paying attention to both. One is the nationalist, fascist, military blogger community. And these are the people who've been very vocal. And actually, most importantly, these are the people who they are allowed by the state to be very vocal because they were significant supporters of the war. And if you read their 500,000 strong followers on Telegram and sites like this, they are now despairing. And they are calling for firmer action, tougher action. Some of these public figures like Prigozhin, who runs the Wagner mercenary group, and the Chechen head whose name I've temporarily forgotten, these people are also outliers and attacking bits of the military, various generals who displease them, the Russian Ministry of Defense. So there is a problem building up in the nationalist fascist community within Russia. There is also a problem building up with the wives and mothers, partners of soldiers killed and injured. Now, we know in the Afghan war that soldiers' mothers, a wonderful group, I met them on many occasions, a very moving bunch of people who just, fought for their memory of their kids. It was really sad to see. There's 100,000 Russian dead. That means, and seriously injured, probably pushing 100,000. That means there are 100,000 wives and partners and girlfriends, occasionally boyfriends, and mums and dads. And that is a significant potential audience. And what hasn't happened is that the new soldiers' mums and soldiers' wives, they have not made common cause with the Democratic faction, which is pretty much non-existent in Russia, and they haven't yet made common cause with the nationalist fascist blogger group, which I think will be difficult. But those are the two groups that I think Putin will probably be looking at most nervously. So, just to sum up, and thank you very much indeed for letting me speak for so long. I think we have to start thinking about the end game, because the end game will probably start happening in the spring. Then we have to start thinking about what will happen with nuclear decision points. Then we have to start thinking about potentially the failure of Russia and what the disaster of a chaotic nuclear-powered Russia looks like. So there is much to do. For the government, I congratulate it on almost all that it's done. I would just say, I think a bit more integration across government departments is always needed, and I still don't have that. And I would just, when it comes to diplomacy, and I asked the Foreign Secretary about this earlier, the US and the UK have the best diplomatic networks in the developing world. Ukraine has very, very few networks in the developing world, or modest anyway, but certainly by our comparison. I think there is much more that we can be doing, the US and the UK, doing systemically across Asia, across Africa, to make sure we partner with the Ukrainians so they can make their case. Because either those nations are nations that are receiving grain from the Ukrainians, and they want to know where that grain is, and we have to ensure that they know it's the Russians who are the problem here, not the Ukrainians. But also, these are the people who are most neutral to what the Russians are doing, and what we have to do is start to get them on side and get that community built. And in the week, on Wednesday evening, there's a Magnitsky Awards in memory of Sergei Magnitsky, beaten to death 13 years ago on Wednesday by agents of the Russian state because he was exposed trying to investigate a £250 million Russian dollar fraud. And we remember people like Magnitsky, but we also remember many of those human rights activists. And it would be great to see more non-aligned and neutral countries and countries in Asia and Africa bringing in their own Magnitsky laws so that they can start prosecuting these bad people, whether in Russia, whether they're in Iran, or whether indeed they're in China. But that's a discussion for another day. Thank you, sir.
Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And can I also thank my honourable friend from the Isle of Wight, who always speaks in such a measured and informative tone, and I always learn from listening to him. Thank you. We've seen horrors taking place in Ukraine throughout this year, but sadly there has been humanitarian need in the region for so much longer. In 2014, Russian annexation of Crimea heavily affected the east of Ukraine. Since Putin's illegal war began in February, it has led to an explosion in humanitarian need, and Ukraine enduring mass human rights violations. The UN Office of Humanitarian Affairs estimates that there are a staggering 17.7 million people in need of humanitarian assistance and an estimated 6.24 million people internally displaced within Ukraine. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine estimates at least 16,150 civilian casualties, with a majority in the east, but stresses the true figure is likely to be very much higher. Evident violations of international humanitarian law have taken place, with Russian forces clearly targeting civilian infrastructure, as we've seen with the bombing of children's playgrounds and supermarkets. Russian forces have hidden landmines across the country, restricting refugees' ability to leave through humanitarian corridors and complicating access for aid workers. The chair of the International Defence Committee, the former chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I wrote jointly to the former Prime Minister in March to highlight these issues, and I continue to urge the current Prime Minister to ensure organisations like the Halo Trust and Mines Advisory Group receive the funds that they need to clear mines on the ground. The current picture is extremely bleak, but with winter fast approaching, it's more crucial than ever that aid reaches people who desperately need it. In December, the daytime temperature rarely reaches above 0 degrees in Kyiv, so generators, blankets and warm clothes are absolutely essential. Women and girls are being disproportionately affected by conflict, with the UN reporting that girls are at an increased risk of child marriage and being forced to leave school as a result of their families simply trying to survive. The UK has pledged 220 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine since the conflict began, but I continue to express my concerns that this aid is not being dispersed quickly enough. In his response, can the Minister guarantee that aid is reaching local charities and being distributed in the most effective ways possible? The conflict has been marked by mass humanitarian rights violations by Russian forces, including the widespread, despicable use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. In October, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine published damning evidence of war crimes, with Russian forces responsible for the vast majority of those. This includes the execution of civilians, consistent accounts of torture and ill treatment, and the use of sexual violence against women and children. The Commission concluded that these violations continue to have a devastating effect for victims and survivors, who emphasise the essential role of justice and accountability. Of the many human rights abuses, several notable examples include the massacre in Bucha, during which civilians were rounded up by Russian troops for execution; the siege of Mariupol, when Russian forces encircled the city, preventing humanitarian supplies being accessible and bombing a maternity hospital; and reports of rape and torture during the Russian occupation of Izum. Those responsible for countless and horrifying crimes must be held accountable, and there must be zero impunity for war crimes committed during the conflict. The events in Ukraine have pulled the importance of a rigorous approach to atrocity prevention into sharp focus. We cannot allow such violations of human rights to occur on this scale, both within and outside of conflict. My committee recently published a report on preventing future mass atrocities around the world, highlighting the need for the UK to develop an atrocity prevention strategy. I urge the Minister to listen to my committee's report and take urgent action to prevent further atrocities taking place. We cannot underestimate the value of a strong position taken by the international community on war crimes, with those who have committed crimes being sufficiently held to account. Victims and survivors deserve our support in supporting justice and ensuring these contemptible crimes cannot go on any longer. The UK's support in Ukraine has been crucial since the invasion took place, but the government must ensure that we provide joined-up responses to the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and prioritise local charities receiving assistance wherever possible. We cannot step away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And for my contribution to this debate, I'm going to talk about support for refugees, and it's always a great pleasure to follow the honourable member opposite for Rotherham and develop on some of her points that she made so powerfully about the humanitarian response, which I'm going to talk to about the local response. And it's somewhat incredible to believe that it's been almost this entire year that we've watched the horrors unfolding in Ukraine, unleashed by Putin, in this absolutely awful war and senseless bloodshed and violence. And what we've seen in my community is the incredible response from all our constituents across the country, and particularly so in Runnymede and Weybridge, where we have opened up our hearts and our homes to the plight of refugees. And I think that's something quite special, because I think there's nothing perhaps more personal in terms of response and support that so many people are given, opening up their own homes to house and support refugees from Ukraine. I think it's something that we should be very proud of. We've got, alongside the big stuff, the incredible international leadership that we've shown in terms of sanctions, in terms of bringing forward a coalition to support the Ukrainians in terms of military technology and kit and training. I think the domestic, rather, should I say small stuff, but necessarily somewhat more, most powerful support I think we've given is to open up our homes in support of refugees. And I want to give a huge thank you to everyone in my constituency who's done that. I'm sure many members equally have thanked their constituents and across the country in terms of support that's been given.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Of course.
Well, thank you. I thank my honourable friend for giving way on this point. Just to echo his comments, in Watford we've had an incredible outburst of love and care for Ukrainian people who are over here. In particular, I just wanted to mention yesterday in St Mary's Church, as part of Remembrance, we had a lady from the group there, also supported by Luther Blissett, the Watford footballer and England legend, and his partner Lauren, where the lady gave this beautiful Ukrainian poem at St Mary's Church from the pulpit, and it was just an incredible moment to bring home the loss that she has being here of her family back home, but also the incredible strength that those people are showing by being here and supporting from afar. So I just wanted to echo those points. Thank you.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for Watford for his intervention, and it builds on the points that I was about to make in terms of paying tribute to particular individuals and groups. Now, it's always very invidious to do this because there's so many people to single out, so many groups to thank in terms of support doing, but I just want to raise just 4 areas of my constituency which I think deserve particular special attention in amongst the work that so many individuals and community groups are doing. One is the Revive Cafe in Chertsey, which has a coffee morning for refugees. One of the key players in this is a lady called Lizzie Wayland, who's a member of the Beacon Church in which this cafe is hosted, and they give incredible support to people locally. I also want to draw the House's attention to Lesia Scoli and Councillor Trusoud, who set up Weybridge Friends of Ukraine, who've been again pivotal in leading support in Weybridge, alongside the Elmbridge CAN and the Weybridge Community Hub. We also have a lady called Alina Melnik, who is a refugee herself from Ukraine, who now works in Runnymede Borough Council, helping with translation for Ukrainian refugees. And I'd like to thank my team in my office, who have been incredible in supporting people in the process of the visa application scheme and many pieces of casework regarding to supporting refugees once they've moved into my constituency of Runnymede and Weybridge. And building on that spirit, I'd like to finish up in terms of my thanks by thanking the Right Reverend Bishop Kenneth Nowakowski, who is from the Ukrainian Catholic Eparchy of the Holy Family in London, who came to speak to community groups and my constituents last week. Now, I don't know if members have heard him speak, but he is incredible. It is probably without doubt one of the best community speech events I've ever been to, where he spoke about, he's been centre of the refugee response from the start, and he spoke about the support he set up, he's given, lessons learnt, a cautious commentary on what he sees as the future. And there were 2 points that really sent a chill, I think. One was a chill, one was less so, as part of his speech, and I hope he won't mind me mentioning. One was when, in a visit to Ukraine recently, he went to a school, and one of the school children, I think it was a little boy, came up to him, very excited to see him, and said, come, you've got to see our bomb shelter. It's really cool. You've got to see our bomb shelter. That sort of sent a chill. I thought it, in a sense, it's also quite sweet, because it just shows the resilience of children and, the excitement of, how life changes and life adjusts in the context of conflict. And another thing that he mentioned during his talk was reflections on when people can start thinking about forgiveness. Where we are now, I think that's very difficult to contemplate. But of course, every war ends, things move on. And one of the things that we were talking about today, which I think is quite important, is the rebuilding of Ukraine, what peace looks like going forwards. Now, as I say, I cautiously say this to the House because I think it's a very difficult statement to make right now where we are and the pain that everyone's suffering. But again, I think needs perhaps thinking in the early stages in terms of what is the future that we want to have, what is the future we can start hoping for going forwards as this awful conflict comes to an end. And I'd like to thank all the people who came to the event that I hosted in my constituency, the community groups, the elected representatives, people who supported refugees across my constituency. Our communities are precious. My communities in Runnymede and Weybridge are, without doubt, the thing that makes Runnymede and Weybridge the best place on earth. In my view, I'm sure colleagues will say similar things about their constituencies. And we need to support our communities. I think we also need to recognise just the incredible work that they do. And I think the response to...
Of course. I'm very grateful indeed. I wasn't intending to intervene in this debate, but I think he's made some very excellent points. I too attended a meeting of Ukrainian family sponsors 2 weeks ago in my constituency. And I think perhaps the thing I took away from there is the message that we can bring back to government to encourage government to do more to support and to encourage our fabulous sponsors to continue to provide that service. In many cases, we're coming to the end of the 6-month initial term, And in Warrington, in parts of Warrington, we have very high levels of Ukrainian families who are thinking about where they can live next, because the sponsors are having given up 6 months thinking about what they do next as well. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the government can take a more active lead on this in terms of supporting and encouraging sponsor families to continue?
I thank my honourable friend, the member for Warrington, for his intervention. It's almost as if he has had foresight on my speech, which I know he hasn't, because the point I was about to go on to was around the challenges in terms of when those sponsor-refugee relationships break down. I'll just finish my last point regarding communities, and then I'll come on to that section. And my last point was essentially that we must all cherish our communities and the support we're giving, because otherwise I think there's something very special. If we don't fight to protect, and cherishing and thanking is part of it, we'll lose them before it's too late. And I think that's an important recognition I'm sure we'll all share. So yes, my final point that I wanted to make is, sadly, for a few months now, we've been hearing in my constituency of breakdowns in relationship between sponsor and refugee. This is getting more concerning as we approach Christmas. I think a lot of people, when very generously they offered to take part in the scheme, saw it as only a 6-month commitment. And I think it's important to recognise, those who can continue for 6 months, fantastic. Those who can't, fantastic for helping out. And I think there should be no animus in terms of what happens in people who can't or feel they can't continue beyond the initial 6 months. My Runnymede Borough Council, I've had many conversations with their leader, Councillor Tom Gracie, and the CEO regarding concerns about the matching process, and some refugees aren't able to be rematched, and Runnymede is going to give them homelessness support, essentially. So they will help rehouse refugees locally who can't be rematched. Now, of course, the concern there is that's going to put an additional burden onto local authorities, and I know the government's been very generous in the support to local authorities, but nevertheless, that will be a different challenge, particularly in the constituencies such as mine, where availability of affordable housing and affordable rents is very much at a premium. And the question I have to the government, to the minister, is in those cases where there's a refugee where the sponsorship has broken down, where they can't be rematched, and the state takes on the role in terms of effectively sponsoring them through homelessness provision. Bearing in mind under the Homes for Ukraine scheme as currently stands, the sponsor gets a monthly payment of about 350 quid. When the state then takes over effectively a state sponsorship role, could it be looked at the local authority getting that sponsorship payment in lieu of the sponsor who would have done so in the first place? Because that seems to be as a cost neutral, in effect, provision, something which is quite a premium at the moment, as always, in terms of supporting local authorities where that's broken down, so there's not undue pressure in terms of homeless provision. Thank you. Go on, just as before I said...
I'm really glad that the Honourable Member has raised this point, because it's a key one. And I wonder if he's also aware that currently it seems the Home Office is funding schemes like this from ODA, the foreign aid money, but they're only able to attribute that for the first year. So I'm very concerned that come February, all of the support that we're able to give to Ukrainian refugees here is going to come to an end. And I'm very interested to see if the Minister has any information that he can share with that about if the Treasury will actually step up and fund those people from that point forward. Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Member opposite for intervention. I mean, looking back at the past year, at the incredible support that we've given to Ukrainians at all levels, I'm absolutely confident that the government will go forward in making sure that we are doing their part. But equally, I would be very interested to know as well in terms of what are the specific plans in terms of how that looks going forward, given, unfortunately, where we are at the moment, it seems that this is going to be a substantially long war. There's going to be displaced people for a long period of time. And so to hear what the medium-term, long-term transition plans would be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to, an honour really, to follow the member from Runnymede and Weybridge and such wonderful ideas that have come from himself and my friend from Rotherham, who sits at my side. A great pleasure to follow both of them. The many excellent contributions here today, I am sure we all recognise the remarkable Ukrainian counter-offensive taking place, particularly in Kherson. To see towns and villages, people being liberated by Ukrainian forces, see the children inching out of their hiding places, families reunited, is deeply moving and a testament to the courage and resilience of the wonderful Ukrainian people. Putin's nuclear and dirty bomb rhetoric is designed to distract from his losses, as well as his efforts to intimidate and divide the West. The best way we can see off any escalation in the rhetoric is through the provision of a long-term plan of support for Ukraine for as long as it takes. With Putin and his gang using energy as a weapon, it is essential that Europe sticks together and holds our course in supporting Ukraine, standing up to Putin, working to maintain public support for Ukraine at home and abroad. Now is not the time for diplomatic squabbles with our allies and neighbours. We must support Ukraine for the long term, way beyond 2023. It will be needed. The government should set aside individual announcements and instead set out a clear strategy in concern with our allies and Ukraine of long-term military, economic, diplomatic support and the rebuilding of all the infrastructure, the civic and all the charities and the volunteers, helping those people to build their lives again, so that we can help ensure Putin's invasion really does end in failure. Make no mistake, Ukraine is fighting this war for our shared values of freedom and democracy. We must never ever forget that. They're fighting nations and nations' war here. We owe so much to Ukraine, to the people, to the leadership there. We owe so much to our own forces and their families. They suffer, they worry about them whilst they're there out in that country. Our support needs to be seen to match their unstinting commitment and suffering. We must thank them all. We must never ever forget them. And we must be there till the end, till we see these people living a life worth living again.
Liam Byrne. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a great privilege to follow such remarkable contributions here today. And it's been especially heartwarming to hear from those members who have talked about those sponsors of Ukrainian refugees, because I think not just across this House, but across this country, there is a shared sense that the brave men and women of the Ukrainian armed forces are fighting for freedom, they are fighting for our values, and they are fighting to ensure that our values do not perish on the continent of Europe. There are those, and we've heard them in the American elections, Mr Deputy Speaker, who are beginning to argue that now advances are being made, and now Ukraine has captured back about half of the territory taken by the Russian invaders. Now is the time to somehow let up. Now is the time to sue for peace. Now is the time to question whether we are supplying too much to the Ukrainian armed forces. These voices must be shut down as fast, as quickly as possible. Now that we have Ukrainian forces on the west bank of the Dnipro River, it is now possible for us to begin, for the Ukrainian armed forces to begin targeting the supply lines into Crimea. And that means Crimea suddenly comes into the crosshairs. And it is now possible for us to think realistically about a battle of the Black Sea in the months ahead. So there are three thoughts I want to offer to this debate. One about the military options and two about the political options that I would be grateful for the Minister to take into account when he winds up the debate at the end of this evening, Mr Deputy Speaker. First, militarily, as former General Ben Hodges argued at the weekend, it is now possible for Ukrainian forces not simply to hit the lines of control into Ukraine with HIMARS systems that they have from the west bank of the Dnipro River, but if we gave them longer range ATACMS missiles, actually it would be possible to extend the ambit of those fires into the Black Sea, and that would begin to allow attacks on Russian Navy assets, from which, let's not forget, they have been firing Caliber cruise missiles at the Ukrainian infrastructure in water and electricity that is putting such pressure on morale that we've heard about this evening. Now, hitherto, America, and I believe it's a position that NATO has taken, has said that those longer range fires are off the table. We've heard from the Americans that ATACMS missiles, because they've got a range of 300 kilometres, could be fired directly into Russia, and therefore they won't be supplied to Ukrainian armed forces. And therefore, we are not equipping Ukrainian armed forces with the full capabilities which we have to offer. Now, given the threat that we know is coming from Russia, given the threat that we know is posed from the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, surely now is the time to take away that red line and actually make available to the Ukrainian armed forces a much wider supply of weaponry so that they can actually begin to double down on the advantage that their courage has bought them with so much blood and treasure over the last few months of this year. Second, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we know that it's not just about projectiles, it is also about politics. And I think there is a lesson to be learned from the way in which we brought Milosevic to the negotiating table during the last Yugoslav war, and it was very simple. We stated in terms that there would be almost an infinite supply of weapons to back the forces of goodness until Milosevic signed up to certain terms and came to the negotiating table. At that point, Milosevic knew that there was no escape. He knew the bombardment would continue until he folded his cards. And so sure enough, he folded his cards and he came to the table and the date and accords with what followed. Surely that is a lesson that we should learn from. Surely now is the time where we don't just say Putin must lead, Russia must fail, the Ukrainians must prevail. Surely now is the time in which we set out in terms what we see as the conditions which we are determined to see met. And until they are met, there will be an infinite supply of weapons from us as the arsenal of hope in this great conflict. And those terms are very simple. They are safe skies, wide, blue, safe skies across 100% of Ukraine. Second, 100% decolonisation of Russian forces from the territory of Ukraine on 1991 borders. Russia must be removed from every inch of Ukrainian land. Third, we must prosecute Russia for the crime of aggression. There are precedents for this in international law. We know how to do it. The case is very clear. We should be making very clear to Putin that that prosecution will now come. Fourth, we should be prosecuting individuals for the war crimes that they are guilty of, not just in Bucha, but across the territory of that black and blood-fouled earth that Russia has invaded. And finally, we must make sure that there is a full exchange of prisoners and repatriation of up to 2 million people who have been moved by the Russians from Ukraine, their homeland, into various parts of Russia. Now, we know that these are the 5 basic demands of Ukrainian leaders because many of us were in the presidential palace in Kyiv when we heard it from President Zelensky. So why it is that the Foreign Secretary, the Secretary of State for Defence, perhaps even the Prime Minister, why they cannot set out there is going to be an infinite resupply of weapons until these terms are met. I don't understand why we are not making that crystal clear to President Putin and to the people around President Putin and to the men and women of the Russian army who are already fairly mutinous. We must make it clear that we're not going away, we're not backtracking, we're not retreating, we are there with the Ukrainian people and their armed forces until every single one of those 5 objectives is met. The final thing that we should be doing, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is increasing the political pressure on Putin and those around him. I completely agree with 100% of what the Honourable Member for Huntingdon said to the House this evening. But I would actually go further. We need to ask ourselves in this House today, why is it that we are not proscribing the United Party of Russia as a terrorist organisation? Are we seriously saying here in this House that the United Party of Russia is somehow better, cleaner than Hamas or Hezbollah or the Basque separatist organisation ETA. These are all political organisations, whether it's with a capital P or a lowercase p. I don't care. These are political organisations, and we prescribe them for the terrorist organisations that they are. So why are we not taking the United Party of Russia through that process, and why are we not challenging every single member of that party to leave it and leave it now? I give way to the honourable member.
I'd just like to say I totally agree with what the right honourable gentleman is saying. I believe that the Prime Minister referred to Russia as a rogue state only today or yesterday, and the consequence of that, one would have thought, would be exactly what he's saying.
You absolutely would have thought of that, because there is no excuse not to think that. But when we put this point to the Foreign Secretary when he came before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee this afternoon, he didn't rule it off the table. He didn't take it off the table, but nor did he give the committee a timetable for that action. And the honourable member is right, because not only should we be prescribing the United Party of Russia for the terrorist organisation it is, we should be designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. This is an appellation that we have plonked on the government and the state of Iran since, I believe, the early 1990s. We actually know already, even before the invasion of Ukraine, that there was a good case for it, because Russia is a sanctuary for the Russian imperial movement, which is an organisation which is designated by the United States as a terrorist organisation. Russia has been providing a safe harbour for that designated terrorist organisation for some years. So why are we not going to commence now the business of designating Russia as a terrorist state sponsor? That has all kinds of implications, not least one of the suggestions that I think the Honourable Member for Huntingdon was aiming at, which is to begin banning tourist visas from Russia immediately. I know that there will always be people in this House who say, well, we can't go to war with the Russian people, we've got to accept that there are good people amongst those tourists, and I hear all of that. But look, if we are serious about making sure that Russia is not able to do this again, then we have to make clear to the Russian people the way in which we see the sins of their nation, and frankly make it crystal clear that they must act within their country to deliver a different kind of leadership in the years to come. The final piece of the puzzle, of course, is sanctions, and I hope that we will be able to have a longer debate about this when the Economic Crime Bill comes back for report stage. But it is obviously ludicrous that the Minister and his colleagues have frozen a $45 million yacht down the road from here in St Catherine Stock, the Phi, and there it is sitting there. As yet, still frozen but unseized. We heard today that Mr Abramovich's money from his sale of his football club has still not actually made it to Ukraine to begin in reconstruction. When are these things going to happen? It is time that we not simply froze assets, we start seizing the assets and rechanneling that money into the supply of Ukraine and its reconstruction. Mr Deputy Speaker, let me just finish with a simple message, which is this. We, in this continent, in this homeland of Europe of ours, we learned a long time ago in international relations from the approach the Athenians took to the poor Malians. They were the people confronted several thousand years ago with the message that might somehow makes right. That is not something that we subscribe to in this country. This is a country that stands up to bullies. And when we see others, like-minded souls, standing up to bullies like Putin, our job is to back them every inch of the way.
Well done. Final speech before the wind-ups. Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and what a very powerful speech to have to follow from the Right Honourable Member for Hodge Hill. But I echo the comment that was made earlier from the Honourable Member for Rotherham. This has been a very informative debate, and in particular I found the contributions of the Honourable Members for the Isle of Wight, Huntingdon and Plymouth Sutton in particular really worthwhile listening. The falling back of the Russian army from Kherson in recent weeks and days presents us with an opportunity to reflect on what the UK and its allies intend will be achieved by our support for Ukraine. To date, our position has simply been that we reiterate our moral and material support, and quite right too. But there have been voices in NATO and here in the UK who've since the spring been urging us to have aims that are independent of those of the government of Ukraine. I'm strongly of the view that as 2022 draws to a close, we should not have stated aims that differ from those of the government in Kyiv. The government in Moscow is determined to paint the war as one that Putin did not seek. When addressing the Russian people and extending the mobilization of Russian citizens, the Russian government seeks to stimulate fear of the West. It's been said several times this evening that the UK supports Ukraine because of our outrage at the invasion in the 21st century of a sovereign state that posed no threat to its neighbours. But an additional reason why the UK's aims and Ukraine's aims are indivisible is to undermine Russia's claim that this is a proxy war, which NATO is using Ukraine to fight on its behalf. Lord David Richards of Hurst-Monzou has argued that the UK and its NATO allies should have a grand strategic war aim with a defined end state. He said in April that without such a well-defined end state, I quote, "there is a risk that events overtake us in the way that happened in 1914. But there are some fundamental differences between now and 1914. In 1914, the UK intervened directly in support of Belgium and deployed the British Expeditionary Force. By contrast, NATO governments have been at pains to demonstrate our restraint by supplying Ukraine with material while avoiding direct involvement of our armed forces personnel in the conflict. There are perhaps some stronger parallels between the situation that we see today and the one that arose in 1916. It had been rumoured in 1916 that some in the United States were seeking to engage Germany and our Entente powers in dialogue with a view to peace. This at a time when the aggressor was still in possession of territory that it had acquired directly as a result of its aggression. Britain's then Secretary of State for War, the Liberal Minister David Lloyd George, pointed out at that time that Britain and its allies were only just beginning to see some successes, and that negotiating a compromise at that time would serve only to reward aggression. Lloyd George talked about the need to ensure that military despotism is broken beyond repair. Last week, it was suggested in the press that some voices in the United States might have been leaning on Ukraine to alter its objectives. US Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, said, "We've seen the Ukrainian military fight the Russian military to a standstill. Now, what the future holds is not known with any degree of certainty, but we think there are some possibilities here for diplomatic solutions." When questioned, the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said, "The US is not pressuring Ukraine and we're not insisting on things with Ukraine." I think we should just stand back and reflect that Baron Richards and General Milley have or are the professional heads of their armed forces. So they've seen enough of war to know that it's a blunt instrument, that it's unpredictable and is inferior in most ways to diplomacy. I think they and others are entirely right constantly to ask questions about the NATO grand strategy and whether we might be able to articulate our own end state or see a diplomatic way out. And on this point, I think I disagree with the Right Honourable Member for Hodge Hill that safe skies implemented by way of no-fly zones policed by NATO would be the right thing. While that was something Ukraine called for early in the war, I was with him in Kyiv when we heard about the sorts of demands that were being articulated by Ukraine today, and I would agree with him that removing Russia from all of Ukrainian territory was much more along the lines of what's being called for today than anything. Of course.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. I too don't believe that there can be a NATO police no-fly zone, but what I do believe is that there can be much greater supply of air defence weapons that we have and Ukraine needs.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for correcting my understanding. I talked last week to a Ukrainian MP from the sister party of the Liberal Democrats, and he talked about how we in the West have failed in the last 2 or 3 decades to fully understand that the Soviet Union was an empire. He suggested that we never fully appreciated that there was not consent for states to belong to the USSR in the first place, and that it had been a Russian KGB-led empire all along, which some in Russia would like to see recreated. These are some reasons why the West should not at this time seek to have aims that differ from those of the democratically elected government of Ukraine. Instead, I would urge that we act solely in support of our Ukrainian ally, because in the 21st century, there's no case for the logic articulated by Catherine the Great that I have no way to defend my borders but to extend them. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Wind up, Stephen Doughty.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank colleagues from across the House for their contributions to today's debate. I think we've had some really fantastic reflections. I also want to add my thanks at the start of the debate to all of the United Kingdom troops and indeed officials who are playing such a critical role in supporting Ukraine, particularly as we remember the sacrifices of past generations in remembrance this weekend. The honourable member from Huntingdon, who was in Kiev with me a few weeks ago, I thought made some very, very important points about the crimes of the Russian regime go much wider than Putin, and I thought particularly of the Children's Commissioner who's been justifying the separation and kidnap effectively of Ukrainian children. Also some very important points about the seizure and repurposing of assets. We heard a powerful speech from the spokesperson for the SNP, again demonstrating the unity of support across this House from all parties. The honourable friend from the Isle of Wight always makes very important points, and I think his reflections on the same brutal tactics that we saw in Syria, targeting of hospitals and others, and also his thoughtful remarks on the next stages of the war and the use of our diplomatic networks were very well put. My honourable friend from Rotherham, I think, made some very important points about mines and unexploded ordnance, the huge challenge that comes with that, and the huge humanitarian need that is there, plus the huge human rights violations that we are seeing tragically revealed with each advance. The honourable member for Runnymede and Weybridge, I think, spoke powerfully of the work in our own communities and the support that's being given. I've indeed seen that, of course, in my own constituency in Cardiff South and Penarth, a new community support centre opening up in Butetown, and regular demonstrations and protests ensuring that people remain engaged with the challenges which are going to continue tragically for some time. Important that we keep on the agenda. My honourable friend from St Helens South and Wiston, I thought spoke powerfully about the scenes we've seen in the last few days in Kherson and the need for the UK to have a long-term plan for as long as is needed, and indeed that was reflected very much in the remarks of my honourable friend from Birmingham, Hodge Hill, who rightly said that we must shut down the siren narratives from what we call them gently the Putin whisperers, whether that's in the US or indeed in our other allies, and again emphasising the need for long-term commitments and long-term supplies for as long as is needed. It was a very powerfully made point, and indeed the comments from the Liberal Democrat spokesperson from Tiverton and Honiton, the importance of aligning with the requests and demands of the Ukrainian government, and indeed some other thoughtful reflections on history. So I think we've had a very, very useful debate today, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I think the proceedings show, again, a true reflection on Britain's solidarity with the people of Ukraine, our collective commitment to Ukrainian freedom, and indeed our unwavering unity in opposition to this illegal war. Indeed, these were points that myself and indeed my right honourable friends, the Shadow Defence Secretary and Shadow Foreign Secretary, made on our visit to NATO this week. Not only the importance of our continued support for Ukraine, but our continued support for our NATO allies in the face of the threats that we face. We are now over 8 months into a war that Putin expected to be over in days, and instead we are here. And the incredible scenes I think that we've seen in the last few days in Kherson, lifting thousands from the yoke of Russian occupation and dealing a devastating blow to Putin, with the price of his miscalculations becoming ever more apparent to his people. And indeed the scenes today, we've seen of President Zelensky there in the centre of Kherson, I think absolutely remarkable. Obviously a very dangerous situation, but I think showing a testament to his bravery and determination from the very top. And that's one thing that I saw in Ukraine, from the bottom to the top, the determination of the entire country to stand together in the face of this absolute barbarous activity from the Russian regime. And I'm sure that the whole House will agree that although the facade of Putin's invulnerability is beginning to dissipate as the war falls into further disarray, this is of course no time for complacency, because we've all seen the critical infrastructure that's been destroyed, the damage that has been done, and despite the huge significance of this victory, with communications, electricity, water and energy utilities decimated, and indeed heinous traps often left by the occupiers, the days ahead will be challenging for the people of Kherson and indeed other regions that are liberated. We also know that Russian shells will tragically continue to fall on the city, and airstrikes will continue to affect Ukraine's urban centres in retaliation, undoubtedly, for this defeat. And the days and weeks ahead will be critical in setting the future course of this war. And indeed, I saw for myself the damage on the outskirts of Kiev on the visit that we undertook. And again, draw attention to my declaration on that matter. I wanted to ask the Minister a number of questions. Firstly, if you could say a little bit more about the support that is being provided to Ukraine regarding demining and the removal of unexploded ordnance. It's a question that came up in a number of the contributions, and I know that we've played a critical role so far, but this is going to be a very, very long job. Secondly, I wondered if he could say, we had many comments in the debate today about the risks of siren narratives of Ukraine fatigue creeping in to the domestic politics of our friends and allies around the world. And of course, we saw some of those narratives before the US midterms from some elements of the Republicans. And indeed, we're seeing those in some other countries too. And of course, we've seen Wagner Group not only committing horrific atrocities, but also being very clear about what they intend in terms of disinformation and undermining our democracies. Prigozhin said himself, and I quote, "We have interfered, we are interfering, and we will continue to interfere carefully, accurately, surgically, and in our own way, as we know how to do in terms of disinformation and misinformation." And of course, they targeted a number of those key races in the United States. They were quite open about attempting to do that, and we know what they've done in elections around Europe. So could the Minister say a little bit more about our efforts to counter that disinformation, to ensure the robustness of our democratic systems and processes, our media, our elections and our political processes, and what steps he is taking with our allies to ensure that that robustness is not just in this country, but indeed across our global alliances? And also, could he say a little bit about, with the G20 taking place these days, with the Prime Minister there in Bali, what steps are being taken to ensure that support amongst our allies and partners is as ironclad as it was in February, and that all wings of our diplomatic coalition recognise that we are in this until Ukraine is the victor. Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to also just address those attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure. We've seen terrible attacks against energy, against water and other areas. We've of course seen the use of Iranian drones as well, and I wondered if he could say a little bit more about what conversations he has been having with allies and also with Israel regarding the wider risks that are posed by allowing Iran to supply this type of weaponry and to use it, and what steps we can be taking together to counter it. I'm grateful for his response to my questions about the generators that we were providing to Ukraine. I understand that 850 have now been provided. I note the comments made by the Minister earlier about support for electricity generation. But what conversations have ministers had regarding long-term needs in this regard? And what conversations have we had with UK manufacturers to ensure there is a joined-up approach to providing power and critical infrastructure to the people of Ukraine going forward? And I think it's also worth pointing out, Mr Deputy Speaker, that Russia's attacks on fuel depots and other utilities have released toxins into the air and groundwater, threatening the environment of Ukraine. And indeed, comments made at COP today by the Ukraine's Environment Minister, he said that 16 million cars in the UK for 2 years is the equivalent of the emissions that have been caused by Russia's actions. So it's not just the death and destruction that we are seeing in cities, it's also the environmental degradation and the risk to our climate that they are providing. We've heard a lot, Mr Deputy Speaker, today about the repurposing of assets and compensation. Indeed, there's been a vote at the United Nations while this debate has been going on, which has made very clear that the United Nations believes that reparations should be paid and that there should be mechanisms for ensuring that compensation is provided to Ukraine. So I wondered if he could say a little bit about the diplomatic efforts in that regard and how he sees that going forward. Mr Deputy Speaker, there are a lot of other concerns that have been raised today about the domestic support. I hope we can have an update soon from the Home Office about the Homes for Ukraine scheme and how our support for refugees is going to continue going forward. There are many, many unanswered questions, and also questions about practical things. Many Ukrainians have raised with me concerns about driver's licences and permits. They were temporarily allowed not to have to register. What conversations has he had with DFT colleagues to resolve that issue? But in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, 8 months since Putin launched this illegal war, we must remind ourselves of one inescapable truth. For Ukraine, this is a war of necessity, of survival. But for Putin, it's a choice, a barbarous choice, a choice to attempt to erase Ukraine from the map and to fulfill his warped imperial ambitions. And that distinction must underscore our continued engagement with allies and partners in emphasising why holding firm, standing united and supporting Ukraine is so critical, whether that is on ensuring that food comes out of Ukraine, that Russia's attempts to block that are fully stood up against, whether that's in the diplomatic coalitions of the United Nations, whether that's on sanctions, whether that's on military and civilian supplies, whether that's on macroeconomic support, and whether that's on the political and diplomatic coalitions that we build. We must stay the course. We are committed on this side to working with the government in supporting Ukraine in the difficult winter ahead and well into the future for as long as it takes. Ukraine must win, and with our support, we can ensure that this victory ends the Kremlin's cycle of warmongering for good.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm very honoured to be able to wind up today. It's been a passionate and very constructive and positive debate, and I'm very grateful for all contributions. I'll try and cover off as many points as possible, Mr. Speaker, in the brief time I have available. I was grateful for the Honourable Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport for pointing out that this is indeed day 264 of this brutal and illegal conflict. But of course, Putin has strengthened, not weakened, the Western alliance, and I'm grateful for his reassurance of support for the government position on this. He made some interesting reflections on the utility of Operation Interflex and the remarkable training that we're doing with our allies for our Ukrainian friends. And he pointed out the need for resolve, and that resolute is what we are, Mr. Deputy Speaker. He appealed for a long-term plan, and I can give him that assurance that we do have a long-term plan. We've announced that next year we will match or exceed the £2.3 billion we put into military assistance this year. Of course, we will underwrite and grant in excess of £1.5 billion of humanitarian and fiscal aid to our Ukrainian friends through the World Bank and the EBRD. Very briefly, yes.
On that point, I thank the Minister for giving way. We have been using up our own supplies. So as well as giving supplies to the Ukrainians, can the Minister reassure us that we're being mindful of our own needs and our own supply base here?
Intervention. He will have noted that the MIN-DP was on the front bench earlier on, and we were discussing exactly that point, and I'm grateful for that intervention. The Honourable Gentleman asked for an IR refresh. I'm not going to give a Runnington commentary, but we should remember that it was basically proved right, the integrated review. We are refreshing it. It's an organic, evolving document, and it's in good shape. He mentioned end-law production. That's a really valuable point. We are working with industry to ensure that there is a pipeline. He made a valuable point about dual-use technology. I am reassured that our sanctions provisions do cover that, but I will look at that RUSI report and ask my MOD colleague to reply to that MIN-DP, because I think that is probably a very important report. He mentioned war crimes. 2 weeks ago I was in The Hague, Mr. Deputy Speaker, meeting with the Chief Prosecutor of the ICC, and he has got the bit between his teeth, and clearly he's independent, but we will support him institutionally as much as we can to hold those prosecuting war crimes to account for the reason of natural justice, but also to deter any further possible war crimes. He mentioned the humanitarian crisis that will surely emerge this winter. We are pleased to be providing £220 million of humanitarian aid, and of course 850 generators for the generation to keep homes warm. He mentioned the defence budget. I'm not going to speculate from the dispatch box about events on this Thursday, but I know he will be patient to hear exactly some of the detail that will be laid out on Thursday's budget. The Honourable Gentleman from Huntingdon, moving on, spoke interestingly of his visit to Ukraine. He has some really interesting reflections on the nature of Russian leadership and the fact that no, Putin did not necessarily mean no war, and I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at it. He speculated about how Putin should be held to accountable and whether it should be Putin or Russia. And of course he also spoke about the reconstruction effort and the funding thereof, and I should remind him that we are very proud to be holding the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference in July next year, and given his long-standing interest in Ukraine, I know he'll take a good deal of interest in that event. The Honourable Gentleman for Western Bartonshire spoke movingly about accountability and war crimes. Again, I reiterate my visit to the ICC and our determination, our expectation that those who have prosecuted war crimes will be held to account. He set this conflict in a very useful global context, which I thought was very interesting, and referred to resource terrorism, and that's exactly what it is with regard to the constraints on the flow of grain from the Black Sea. He spoke about the existential nature of Ukraine's noble struggle, and I was very interested to hear his remarks about the activities and operations of the Pride Brigade, and that was most welcome, and I was interested to learn about that. And I thank him, as ever, for his ongoing support of him and his party for the government's position with regards to Ukraine. My honourable friend from the Isle of Wight spoke with characteristic knowledge and insight about the two-pronged approach of the Russian war machine in Sirovikin, that being the Dnipro defensive position on the river and the use of defensive position on the river, and also their abhorrent and entirely outrageous attempts to smash civilian infrastructure, including hospitals. He drew a morbid parallel with Syria, which was interesting, but of course deeply worrying, and of course raised the terrifying spectre of the use of chemical weapons. Of course, I think he's right in his judgment that Putin has bought some time, but of course, perhaps, Mr. Deputy Speaker, perhaps there is some sort of revolutionary endgame. Who knows? But I thought his speculation and his various scenarios that he laid out were interesting and, of course, based in a deep knowledge of that country, given his former residence there. He appealed for... yes, please.
I'm very grateful to the Minister. Given that he recognises the risk of Putin damaging Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, why does he argue that we shouldn't be providing longer range fires to Ukrainian armed forces in order to counter that?
Well, I would say all options remain on the table. I would note that the Ukrainians have been, thanks to Western support, been terrifically effective at taking some of the ballistic barrage down from in terms of defending their skies. But of course, I'm not going to rule out anything from the dispatch box. If I can move on to the Honourable Lady for Rotherham, the Chair of the International Development Committee. She made a good remark about the Halo Trust. I can confirm that we continue to support the Halo Trust, and they have so far cleared 16,000 square metres of land in the Kyiv Oblast and will continue to do so. We have pledged £220 million of humanitarian aid, and I can assure her this is reaching the front line, as it were, in terms of the people that do need it, and we're working with the United Nations, the Red Cross, NGOs, and through 13.4 million people have been helped so far with funds distributed. She also mentioned accountability, and I draw reference to my previous remarks about the ICC, and she appealed for a joined-up approach, which is exactly what we're after, and I have not yet read her report, but I look forward to reading it. I'm very grateful for her bringing it up. My honourable friend from Runnymede and Weybridge made a moving speech reflecting on the great compassion shown by his constituency. He referred to the remarkable way that his constituents had opened up their hearts and their homes. I think every member of this House will have seen that in their own constituency. I've certainly seen that in Aldershot, and I'm grateful. I second his thanks that he put on record for the Revive Cafe in Chertsey and the Weybridge Friends of Ukraine and the Weybridge Community Hub. And he asked a technical question about homes for Ukraine and the extent to which a provision might be made directly to the local authority if it wasn't going via host families. I haven't got an answer right now, but I will ensure that a colleague from Department of Levelling Up and Communities writes to him, but also the chair of the International Development Committee. The Honourable Lady for St Helens and South, very, very briefly.
Very briefly, may I share the points that honourable members and colleagues and friends made across the House about the need to support Ukrainian refugees in the long term for as long as they need to be here, but also ask him to reflect on how we support their mental health as they deal with crisis from afar, and in particular how government and local government can support groups who are helping so many at the moment. Thank you.
I'm grateful for that intervention. That is well noted, and I also put on record my thanks for the work he does as a mental health champion, and also for his support to our Ukrainian friends in his own constituency of Watford. The Honourable Lady for St Helens and South Weston spoke movingly about in an appeal for solidarity among the allies of Ukraine, and that's exactly what we see on the diplomatic front, on the military front, and in terms of reconstruction. I see that very visibly and powerfully when travelling and talking to allies right across Europe, and I think we are bold in our resolve to see this through. The Right Honourable Gentleman for Birmingham Hodge Hill spoke passionately and laid out three very interesting points. Firstly, with regard to the military dimension, an appeal to provide long-range fires. As I said, I'm not going to rule anything in or out of the dispatch box, but of course all options continue to be under review. I appreciate the way he described the fact that the Ukrainians' courage had brought them a huge advantage, and I think that is at the heart of their successful prosecution of their counterattack. It's their courage which has brought them a significant advantage. He also referred to the utility of having an infinite supply of arms, and drew an interesting historical parallel with Milosevic. I thought that was interesting in terms of the context of there being an arsenal of hope in terms of the Western allies, and I thought that was useful, and I'm grateful. He referred to political pressure and quite forthrightly challenged the government to designate United Russia Party and just designate Russia as a state sponsor of terror. That's an interesting proposition. I'm not going to make a pronouncement about that, but I'm grateful for the passionate way in which he's raised those questions. And he also raised some interesting technical questions about sanctions. We are getting after not just sanctioning, but also seizing and ensuring that things like, for example, the monies from the sale of Chelsea Football does get to those who need it. But I'm grateful for his interest. The Honourable General for Tiverton Honiton made an interesting parallel to 1916, and also gave some really good insights from his discussions with a Ukrainian MP colleague, for which I was most grateful. And he made a very interesting remark about Catherine the Great's approach to her borders, which is frankly is worrying given the imperial parallels that are sometimes drawn by the Russian leadership themselves. In conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman for Cardiff South and Penarth gave some good reflections on the impressive sight of President Zelensky visiting Kherson, leading from the front as ever. I was very grateful for his remarks about that. And he speaks from a position of knowledge, having visited Kyiv recently. Grateful for his constructive and positive tone as ever. And in brief, Mr Speaker, we will continue to support the Halo Trust's effort to continue demining. We are working with allies to counter disinformation across the region in all domains, and that continues apace. He appealed for unity, and I think we do have that with our allies. He mentioned drones and Iran. We are getting after that with our very aggressive sanctions policy, but we'll look at dual use in that regard. Very, very briefly, if the House will indulge.
I asked him specifically, had he yet raised that issue with Israel, and also given the rumours that Iran has been supplying medium-range ballistic missiles as well to Russia to be stationed in locations capable of targeting Kiev?
Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you. I think my understanding is that has, but let me just check, and I will write to the Honourable Gentleman. I want to be complete in my answer. He mentioned generators. We are getting off that, and 850 have been committed. I should also say that 10 million has today been committed by the Foreign Secretary to the electricity rebuilding, reconstruction, for technical reconstruction of power generating capability. The first 5 will be committed today, but it's of a 10 million fund. And he mentioned reparations. Again, I think that's something to be broadly considered. But Mr Deputy Speaker, if I can just reiterate that we will not be deterred from supporting Ukraine. And I just wanted to draw members' attention to the fact that a good measure of our resilience and the strength of our alliance is that last month at the United Nations, 143 countries, 3/4 of the membership of the United Nations, voted to condemn the outrageous and illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory. This was a measure, Mr Deputy Speaker, the fact that Ukraine is strong because it has many friends, and Russia, despite having a very, very long border, has very few friends. We are proud to stand with our Ukrainian friends for freedom, democracy and the sovereignty of nations around the world, and we will proudly continue to stand with them until they are victorious. Thank you, Mr Deputy.
And on Thursday, I was privileged to be at a Ukraine fundraiser at St Peter's Church at Wilton Place in London, where it was a very Welsh theme. That's why I'm looking at you, Stephen, with the London Welsh Choir and my good friend, the soprano Rebecca Evans, singing as well. It was ethereal music for a just cause, and I hope we raise substantial sums of money and pay tribute to all of those throughout the country who are helping to raise funds for the Ukraine cause. The question is that this House has considered the situation in Ukraine. As many as for that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary no? I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Andy Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm very grateful to have been able to secure this debate to discuss the impact of low traffic neighbourhoods in Latchford. And while I go on to talk about the practical and environmental impact of these initiatives, or rather the lack thereof, as I'll explain in the case of Warrington South, I'll be focusing on my constituents' experiences of the Westy Low Traffic Neighbourhood Zone, which was imposed by Warrington Borough Council on people living and working in the Latchford area of my constituency earlier this year. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is an issue myself and Conservative councillors have been at odds with Labour over for some time now. I've had many meetings with local residents and business owners who've told me they are angry and quite simply fed up with the low traffic zone that's been forced on them without proper consultation, and that the council have failed to listen to their concerns over the scheme. Now, in explaining the background of what's been happening in Latchford,